line is that making responsible and effective COVID-19 viz is hard. And so really quickly going to go through a couple of places where um, people kind of fell short when trying to visualize COVID-19. Some common pitfalls of visualizing this data. Um, this graph was shown in a local Fox News broadcast. Um, Aesthetically, it's definitely not the prettiest graph, but if you look carefully at the y-axis, um, you'll notice something weird. So the number is jumping in weird intervals, right? So this is not something we really want in a y-axis graph. And for those who know about log graphs, this is not that because you'll see here we're jumping by 30, 30, 10, 30. Me trying to do math quickly is difficult. 30, 30, 50, 10, right? The intervals are strange. This is another 50 jump up here too, uh, which is very bizarre. I personally have actually not seen a y-axis that weird in a while, and it's kind of rare to see it that weird. But think about the audience in this case, right? Someone watching TV, their local news station, is just looking at this graph quickly, is taking in like, all right, cases up here, time is happening this way, and they're looking at new cases per day. And this kind of was shown in April, so this is a while back now. So don't, yeah, this is a very low number compared to where we're at right now. But these inconsistent intervals actually make these case jumps on a regular basis seem either smaller or bigger than they should be. So if someone is casually just watching this on TV, people can make their own inferences and conclusions about that, right? They're going to be like, oh, this huge jump here, which actually, might actually be that big because of how the y-axis is being drawn, might be like, oh, what was happening at that time? Well, then this must have caused it, right? Like, there's so much space for a casual viewer to jump and make inferences about what's happening with this data. The other downside to COVID viz is that if it's done kind of lazily or not well, it can be fodder for conspiracies around the spread of COVID. Many of these types of conspiracies are supported by maps like these. So what we have here is actually two completely separate maps, just sort of juxtaposed on top of each other. The top one is claiming that countries, with 5G, it's labeled here in the sort of red color, seem to be overlapping with countries that have COVID cases. So if you look, actually, there's a lot here, right? But if you look really carefully at this bottom map, you'll notice that the shading isn't, presence versus absence. It's not just like one shade of red and then sort of like beigey up here. There are many shades of red, but there's no scale to indicate what that means. All that's written here is that red countries with 100 or more confirmed cases, and beige countries with fewer than 100 cases. So this was, granted, this was earlier on in the pandemic. 100 cases in a country is actually an important number, but it actually is more what epidemiologists use to mark the start of a pandemic, as opposed to a comparison point. A lot of data viz these days, when looking at the trajectory of the pandemic, is trying to actually start mapping data starting at 100 days, or sorry, the day at which a country reaches their 100th case, because then you can reliably say there's an outbreak in that country. So that already is a weird dichotomy to set up for this map. The other thing is that countries are kind of being labeled just based on that one metric, without any kind of consideration for population. So think about it, right? So if a country has 100 cases, but they have 300 million people, that's really different than 100 cases showing up in a country with 10 million people. So right, we have a lot of issues here. But fundamentally, the biggest problem here, which some of you might have already picked up on, is this association. So the person who made this meme or whatever put these two together and is strongly implying that these two things are associated with each other or correlated. Of course, we know that correlation does not equal causation. This cartoon is essentially indicating this really common phenomenon with issues with making maps with data, especially in the United States, as an example here. The maps in the cartoon on the right are arguably all much more similar to each other than these two are, but that's because they're all actually showing the same thing, which is population. When you don't normalize for population, you can look at lots of different metrics that essentially just follow where people tend to cluster across a country. So population normalization is actually one of the most important things you can think about when making viz, especially when you're trying to compare the spread of COVID across different regions. That photo of Trump I showed earlier, holding up that case fatality rate bar chart with the 4 countries. So that segment was part of, I guess now infamous show of Chris Wallace's Fox News program. And so right after actually that was aired, Chris Wallace's show inserted this sort of fact check image to highlight that, more than just 4 countries, there are more countries on this list. Surprise, surprise, there are other countries in the world. So now including Italy, Spain, Brazil, and South Korea. U.S. does not have the lowest case fatality rate in the world. Again, this is not a comprehensive list of countries, but it's at least a few more than what the president showed. And the issue here, right? So a viewer seeing this is like, oh, so Trump just didn't include a few more countries, but the United States still has a pretty low case fatality rate, so not so bad. But actually, if you zoom in on the top of this literal graph they showed, so this is from Oxford researchers who did this graphic, they actually, the ones who calculated this case fatality rate, they warn against assigning too much importance to the metric. This is kind of not super clear just because of the quality of the picture, but it literally reads, during an outbreak of a pandemic, the CFR, the case fatality rate, is a poor measure of the mortality risk of the disease. So, the fact that people are even using this as a metric for assessing how dangerous this disease is somewhat flawed. But again, right, that's just a nuance that the viewer is just not party to. They miss that entirely because this is just a series of lines and they're looking for the lowest one. So we looked at a couple of examples of kind of viz having some issues with COVID spread. And there are plenty more examples out there of this. Oftentimes, some of the mistakes are inadvertent. Most of the time, actually, I would say they're inadvertent and not malicious. But again, this is the job of the person creating the visualization to do this responsibly. Oftentimes, for something like COVID, it's not just on one person. We have typically teams of people working on this. You have epidemiologists, policymakers, all interfacing with designers to actually collect the expertise into one place and create the best possible and most informed visualization. And that was definitely the case for the Financial Times data journalism team. So these graphs became really, really popular. Line graphs became very, very popular since they kind of started popping out in March. So John Byrne Murdoch, who works at the Financial Times, on March 11th tweeted this line graph, which initially, I think there are now 50 iterations of this now. It's many, many versions. But initially this was showing the cumulative number of COVID cases in major countries. The Financial Times has a European tilt, so some more European countries are listed here. His graphs were unique in that he used a logarithmic scale, which is actually quite good because mainly viruses spread exponentially over time. And so this allows for a more clear, direct comparison across countries. You can imagine if this weren't logarithmic, you'd have this kind of weird big slope for every one of these countries that's sort of redundant for that initial sort of exponential phase. And so comparing countries more directly in using the kind of real estate of the graph is kind of enhanced by using the logarithmic scale. There are also a lot of really good design choices. I'm not going to spend too much time today talking about, color theory or accessible design, but these are actually really important things to consider when you're getting into data viz. I'll talk a little bit about that in the coding video, but a couple of things here that are great is sort of the color scheme that John is using here is really distinctive and kind of very appropriate for what he's trying to show, right? The lines themselves are colored in a way to draw attention to the data. The fonts are all clear and clean. The graph itself is extremely minimal, so there's really like no clutter. Like you have the absolute minimal kind of information you need. So you're not kind of like spending a lot of time visually trying to figure out, not a lot of cognitive work to figure out like what really is happening, right? And the really, really great thing that John did with this, that a lot of great, data viz practitioners do, is to use annotations. So here you can see he's written in a couple of notes here. So for South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, he has this sort of dotted line to indicate the 33% daily increase. Like this is what that is. And so, if a line is sort of wavering above that in this above the 33% line, they're sort of in this one category of spread. And if they're below, that's more where a country will want to be. And so without these annotations, someone would ask, okay, so what makes South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong so special? Without the annotations, the audience has to do that work or imagination or whatever it is, right? But John is doing that work here for the viewer by putting in specific policy measures that the different countries have taken, as well as some caveats as well too, right? So, for example, South Korea spread slowed from initial pace, but it's picked up again. So it's not like all happy-go-lucky there. And Japan's rate is low, but there's debate about whether enough tests have been done to kind of capture the real spread. Singapore, Hong Kong, super, super low spread, both having strict quarantining and very rigorous contact tracing. Hong Kong also having rapid school closures. So this is just a very simple kind of example of how you can just add a little bit extra to a graph to really make it compelling and provide that context. The kind of like point of this graph, right, was John has talked about this quite a bit about his series of graphs, is to drive the inevitability of coronavirus and how countries are sort of going down the same path as Italy was at the time, which was considered sort of ground zero for Europe for COVID, when they don't adopt certain public health measures like quarantines and robust testing. And Financial Times team plus John, they went on to host make graphs like these for a bunch of other metrics that became, rapidly, as teams kind of work together, right? This is part of like what working in a collaborative group does. You had epidemiologists being like, well, actually this measure is really good to look at as well too. So things like excess deaths, hospitalization, ICU capacity, these are all very unique and different metrics with which to look at the spread of COVID-19. On the flip side, right, the problem with putting out a viz into a public space, so John tweeted this out, the graph I showed before, is that there's always room for some sort of like appropriation or recontextualization. So this was a few weeks later. John had another graph. Again, it's another cumulative number of cases. Number of days since 100th case. Remember that I mentioned as being kind of like the gold standard for, this is when the country has an outbreak, so we're going to start counting from here. Someone saw John's graph and was like, all right, I'm going to circle all of the countries with, this was lower lower trajectories, lower spread of cases, and the ones above, and just give them their own sort of, annotation. In this case, it's no masks versus masks. This is obviously a really aggressive simplification of the differences between two successive countries. It's kind of masked by the uh, big red and big blue circles, but there are a lot of countries in this no mask category. There's the U.S., there's Turkey, there's the UK, Brazil, Spain. Um, I guess Italy is kind of in there as well too. Uh, and so I think it's not too difficult to see how those countries cannot all be sort of summarized into mask non-mask adhering countries. Um, if we know anything, we know mask wearing is something that is extremely variable across populations within a country, let alone across countries. But there are other things happening in each of these countries. Like I mentioned, mitigating factors like policy changes, demographic differences, things like that, right? Um, whether or not quarantines are being enforced, test and trace programs, all of this stuff is happening at the same time as data collection. And so for someone to go in and just be like, well, solve this problem, it's no mask versus mask, is a gross simplification. The sad thing is underneath all this kind of like garish like annotation, John actually did a lot of work to annotate the different countries to kind of provide context for what's happening in different countries. Um, but when you're sharing something on social media, this is something to be really wary of, because people want to apply their own narratives to data that they see. This is something that's happened time and time again. People come in to looking at data with their own preconceived biases, and they love data that kind of confirms it. Even if it doesn't actually confirm it, they can kind of warp and annotate things to fit their own narratives. Another phenomenal example of COVID-19 viz this past year has been from the Reuters graphic team. So again, strongly, strongly, strongly recommend all of their work. It's absolutely gorgeous. They have a live coronavirus case tracker in the United States, which is one of my personal favorites. So this is updated regularly. I'm looking at it right now. Um, Updated today, January 4th. Um, and yeah, I'm just going to scroll through this just to highlight um, a few things here. So yeah, so I would first want to say, like, a very common thing with data viz that you'll see online that's wonderful. I'm going to show a couple examples of this, is what's called scrolly telly, which is kind of a silly phrase, but the idea is right. Much the way you read like any kind of article online, you're scrolling through a page, but instead of just text, you're getting visuals to provide context and distill data. So in this case, this is sort of what Reuters does. The thing I want to focus on their tracker page, there's a lot more on this page, is their sort of mini map across the state. So here, right, you probably recognize this is a representation of the United States of America. Each state, instead of being the state, is represented by a trend line, again, a line graph. So time being on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the weekly reported cases per 100,000 in the population. So right away, we see that this is a normalized number. And why is it normalized? Because that was what makes it comparable across states. There are states with a lot of people, and there's states with not that many people. So if you don't do this type of normalization, your comparisons are going to be completely messed up. The other cool thing here for the user is that you can actually flip between an adjusted scale and a uniform scale. And so what this means, you might be like, oh, that's a cool feature you can toggle. So Reuters actually tells you, it's pretty small down here, but uniform scale shows all the states on the same vertical axis, right? So imagining these are like pure case numbers in a way, so that they're comparable, right? New York having this many cases and this many cases, things like that, versus the adjusted scale, which emphasizes the trajectory in each state by recalibrating the vertical axis according to the state's highest weekly figure. So this is more of like this is the shape of the pandemic trajectory in this state. And this is a more kind of like, if we're going to set the scales to be uniform across the different states. And the other feature here, so this is a little like kind of yellow shading, where cases have risen for more than 2 weeks. So in this case, New York, Virginia, Georgia are highlighted here. This obviously changes over time. Over the course of the pandemic, this has looked very different. But these are helpful metrics, right, to kind of compare severity and kind of aggressiveness of the spread of the pandemic. The other feature here, a lot of the stuff I was showing before was cumulative cases. So like literally raw numbers of cases. But what this is weekly reported cases. So this is at the end of every week, as of Sunday each week. These are the sort of cases for that batch. The reason why this is done weekly is to kind of distill the potential effects of any single day being a particular problem. So one very common issue with COVID data, departments of health across different states and countries, of course, collect data very differently, and individual days might have issues with reporting. So a country can simply just, a state can have like a data entry issue one day. Maybe, we just had the holidays, like there could have been a lag in reporting. There could have been like a system failure with like where the data was stored. Like there are a whole bunch of things that could happen with data entry. Or there could be like an actual issue with the way in which data is collected. So maybe data was initially classed as tests and said those were cases, and stuff like this happens. And so you want to kind of remove the noise of individual days, and so this is why it's weekly reported cases as opposed to daily cases. And another phenomenal data viz from this year was from Harry Steens at the Washington Post. Again, their graphics team is phenomenal, so definitely recommend their work. This was a very, very cool and unique type of visualization. So this was at the very start of the pandemic. This is March 14th. This actually became the #1 most visited site in the Washington Post site history ever. It's translated into many languages now, as you can see here. And so really briefly, I'm going to jump through this page. Again, it's one of these like scroll type situations. And what this was trying to do is to essentially use simulations to explain how the virus spreads over time by creating this sort of fake virus called simulitis, kind of acting in lieu of COVID. But just to understand, why actually social distancing measures and measures like those actually work to flatten the curve per se, right? So this starts off again. This is a while ago now. It feels like years ago. But this was sort of like how cases initially kicked off in the U.S. It does a really good job of breaking down some of the jargon around COVID initially too, which I'm sure will be helpful to kind of any person reading it. But the idea here, right, they create a fake disease simulitis. The idea is that it spreads pretty easily. So whenever a healthy person comes into contact with a sick person, that healthy person becomes sick too. Just like this, kind of just like when these little like balls of people, I should say, touch. It's pretty quick for everyone to catch this fake disease. But then, of course, people recover over time. So again, this is a situation where we're making assumptions. This is not COVID. People are also actually dying of the disease too, but this is assuming that people are recovering from the disease. And so just to highlight the spread of this, right? Essentially the way this visualization works is Harry is having simulations run. So it's a new simulation every time you run it of what happens to the kind of recovered, healthy, and sick population under different scenarios. So in this case, yeah, we have um, it's a little bit glitchy. So sorry about that. A lot of people are getting sick pretty fast. This curve is big. Um, Over time, people do recover, but a lot of people had to get sick first for this to happen. Um, and this is a relatively small population. Uh, there are 330 million people in the United States, so that curve would steepen for a long time before it started to slow. Now, in a case that China tried in the Hubei province, um, they tried a forced quarantine. So this is sort of what that simulation is like, where we quarantine off the sick population. But of course, forced quarantines actually don't really work because, as Harry mentions here, um, it's not realistic. So people can't actually be quarantined entirely, and there are always going to be leaks, and so those leaks eventually impact the rest of the population. What happens when 3/4 of a population adopt social distancing? So you see some of the balls just sort of stop moving, um, while some of the other little balls continue moving around. And let's see what happens with this trajectory. We're literally seeing the flattening of the curve happen in real time in the simulation. So, right around this time in March, there was a lot happening with that flatten the curve kind of mantra. But a lot of people were like, well, why? I don't really get why I'm doing this entirely. Like, I sort of get like I'm supposed to, but doesn't make sense. And so this did a really, really good job of explaining this um, kind of public health stance that was taken early on in the pandemic, where even fewer people are moving around. So just one out of every eight people are moving around, while other people are sort of social distancing in this case. Um, and that curve is about as flat as it can be in this case. Again, this is a fake disease. There are so many other kind of aspects to COVID that are different than this, but in terms of conveying a pretty complex epidemiological and public health um, concept, this does a really, really good job of distilling down why things like social distancing work, even if on a moderate level. So, right, as a summary of this, you know, how flattening the curve can look like in real time. Um, this is sort of what we experience. And these simulations are, again, this is generated every time someone loads the page. Um, and so this is really kind of like strong interactive feeling to this, and exploring different cases, um, different conditions to see like outcomes and how data changes according to those outcomes. And probably my favorite set of visualizations was from the New York Times graphics department. They produced some of like the absolute best data viz that I've ever kind of seen, and their COVID work was remarkable. Some of their best work, they had a sort of pair of articles, how the virus got out, which was sort of from the China end, exploring the virus's trajectory out to other countries. But the how the virus one story is the one I want to focus on, because this is focused on the United States. So I'm going to just quickly skim through this and highlight a few things that this does extremely well. Um, so again, this is sort of the scrolly telly format, where you're scrolling through and you're kind of getting new information broken down into kind of like bite-sized chunks, and so this makes it very, uh, you know, easy to digest for someone just kind of coming in and being like, I don't know how to ingest this data. So the flip side to the static graphs, which are also great because they're just very kind of efficient. You just kind of like see it and you get your takeaway. Interactives take a bit more time to go through, but they can in that respect cover a lot more ground. And so starting off from the first cases in the states, known cases I should say, and sort of following the story of those cases, but then actually tracking this on a map. Talking about hidden infections, which we now know was a huge problem. We didn't have adequate testing, so we did not know and have any sense of the spread of this disease at the outset. Over 2,000 infections spreading throughout major cities. And we tried some travel restrictions, but they weren't full bans. Lots of infected travelers coming in from the rest of the world, right? Because it's already been spreading for a bit, and seeded initial outbreaks in the country. And then over this kind of critical window that now we are very familiar with, where we didn't have the kind of testing to understand the extent of these outbreaks. Meanwhile, the virus is just spreading very happily. And again, this is also being paired with what's happening, what else is happening in the country, policy decisions, changes in travel that don't really kick in really until March, right? Um, and so from March 1st to March 14th, a lot of people are still moving very normally across the country. This is cell phone data. So now we're getting into this really cool thing that the New York Times does, is overlaying different types of data. And throughout this, right, they're also making, they're pausing with each new data set and saying, hey, this is this data we have, this is how it's aggregated, this is the data source, which is really important to do for someone just kind of like coming into this and not really knowing what to get out of this. Again, you have date stamps for everything. We're zooming in on specific locations to get a better picture. The text blurbs are very helpful to kind of frame the data story. And also throughout this, I'll say, like, the kind of color choices here are very powerful, right? Your eyes immediately go to these very stark, kind of the blue, the red. They're not these kind of like bold sort of blue-red colors. They're muted in a way, but everything else is sort of minimalized to be absolutely essential, again, to declutter the picture and focus on the critical parts. Um, love the great quotes in here too from politicians who made choices. This is one of the, in my opinion, one of the most powerful pieces of Viz that the New York Times did, because it does this very kind of like whole picture look at what was happening at every stage in this process. And then even beyond travel movement data, now we're getting into the actual genetic mutation data, a whole nother type of data. But right, they're able to take this as well too to study the spread and talk about different variants of COVID. Again, visualizing this in an extremely compelling way. And by March 13th, when lockdowns kind of started, and that was when travel was limited from Europe, the outbreak was already kind of in full force across the country. There's obviously a huge amount of data that goes into what they're showing in terms of hotspot data across the country, where cases are breaking out. But the story also stops and takes a minute to look at very specific cases. So in this case, centering on this one woman who traveled from New Orleans, where we now know there was an outbreak at that time, to Memphis, um, helping seed a case there. So again, this is something similar to what the Washington Post piece did, in that they distill things down to the individual level, right? One ball kind of infecting another ball. In this case, it's how one person's movement went and then seeded an entire new outbreak. And in many ways, this is kind of similar to that kind of like abstract balls floating around. But the context here of the text, this is real data. This is not a fake virus, right? Of who was traveling where, what was happening in the country at the time. And this is when the lockdown sort of kicked off. This article came out in June, and so this was tracking sort of movement over time. I'm also going through this very quickly, so please take your time with this. I just want to kind of highlight some of the cool things I liked about this piece that are really powerful. Again, the color is really very minimal, but it's powerful because it's highlighting specific, the most specific and important aspects of this story. So we kind of slowed exponential growth from those early reductions in movements, and just thinking back to those simulations of flattening the curve. Being in New York City, right, this is specific to what was happening here. Again, going back to the idea that different regions are very hard to compare unless you control for many different factors. So the kind of politics and logistics and infrastructure of New York plays a very different role there in how daily life is affected. It's not just the disease at play. Kind of continuing now to the deaths data. So before it was cases, and now we've moved to deaths, which of course were extremely bad. April, May in New York City. And this piece of data viz was also, has a point. At this juncture, there was the main kind of story of not enough testing happening in the country, and so this story has this message of we don't actually know how bad it can be because we still can't, test the people that we need to test. And this has been a problem to this day, but at the time that was extremely problematic. Testing hadn't really ramped up to the level it needed to. And, by late June, we had outbreaks seeded across the West and South. And this might be the part people tend to gloss over, but this is actually really, really important for data viz. This is a really intense rundown and detailed rundown of exactly how they did everything they did in here, right? How they estimated different sets of data, how they collected different sets of data, the limitations of different sets of data. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but right, who they collaborated with, right? There are so many different people they're interfacing with here. So there are scientists they're talking to for the genetic samples, companies that are collecting different types of data, right? The cell phone data that was collected to kind of capture movement. But again, there are limitations to all these things too. How they classify different areas, and then conclusions and quotes from even politicians as well too. Um, and on top of that, more sourcing for their story as well too. So this is just like an extremely comprehensive way of telling a story. This is obviously not your typical data viz, but it's a kind of like gold standard for how we can break down the story of the spread of the virus in an extremely thorough way.